Welcome to the Emerging History channel. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out more videos like this one.
Frankfurt, 1946. A man walks home through rubble and silence, finds only a bombed shell where his family once lived, and stands there, utterly alone, holding everything he has lost. In a quiet room in 1974, photographer Jack Bradley raised his lens just as Harold Whittles, born into total silence, felt an earpiece settle in place and heard for the very first time the world. Somewhere in 1955, a man holds a squirming puppy behind his back. A boy stands inches away with no idea what is coming, and the whole weight of human joy is balanced in that single hidden hand. In Rohrmann's divided cemetery, a Protestant colonel and his Catholic wife lie on opposite sides of a wall neither could cross in life, their stone hands reaching across it still, clasped together across death. On a French beach in 1922, Winston Churchill, the man who would one day rally a civilization, stands in a bathing suit, squinting into the sun, looking remarkably, disarmingly, and almost tenderly ordinary. Around 1855, Dr. John Murray raised his camera toward the Taj Mahal, capturing in silver and light a tomb built by 22,000 hands, 1,000 elephants, and 40 years of an emperor's consuming grief. Around 1890, London's Queensway station glows with gaslight and ambition, a city already burrowing beneath its own streets to escape the gridlock above, quietly inventing the future of how the modern world would move. In 1945, Harold Agnew walks across a tarmac smiling, cradling a small metal box as casually as a lunch pail, entirely unreadable from the outside, entirely responsible for 70,000 deaths that have not yet happened. In Pueblo, Colorado, in 1905, a horse stands at the edge of a 60-foot tower, the crowd below already holding its breath, and in one suspended second before the plunge, nothing about this seems impossible. Before radar changed everything, Emperor Hirohito of Japan moved solemnly between enormous trumpet-shaped instruments in the 1930s as soldiers pressed their ears to steel and listened to the sky for the sound of approaching danger. On a New York platform in 2012, Ki-suk Han reaches desperately for the edge as a train bears down, while a photographer captures what onlookers cannot stop, and a city watches helplessly from 2 feet away. Somewhere above Sydney in 1970, amateur photographer John Gilpin caught what no one was meant to see. 14-year-old Keith Savfk, falling 200 feet from a Japan Airlines wheel housing, caught forever between the plane and the ground. On September 3, 1967, Sweden changed the side of the road it drove on overnight, and by morning the streets looked exactly like what they were, a nation collectively forgetting, all at once, everything it had ever known. In Tokyo's Hibiya Hall in 1960, 17-year-old Otoya Yamaguchi rushed a stage mid-sentence, drove a samurai sword through a politician's ribs on live television, and handed Yasushi Nagao a photograph that would win the Pulitzer Prize. From the deck of the Carpathia in 1912, survivors of the Titanic climbed slowly aboard, wrapped in blankets and borrowed silence, carrying nothing but themselves out of water, cold enough to kill a person in 15 minutes. In Washington in 1981, Pablo Escobar posed for a tourist photograph in front of the White House with his young son beside him, already supplying 80% of the world's cocaine and earning $400 million a week. On June 18, 1964, in St. Augustine, Florida, a hotel owner poured acid into his own swimming pool to drive out the black and white protesters, who had jumped in together, and the whole country was watching. On April 12, 1912, at Crosshaven, Ireland, the Titanic slipped out of frame and turned westward toward New York, magnificent unhurried, 3 days away from the bottom of the Atlantic, and 1,500 people away from mourning. In a school photograph taken in Linz, Austria in 1899, a 10-year-old boy sits at the center of the top row, squinting faintly at the camera, unremarkable in every way and entirely unrecognizable as the century's greatest monster. In Owensboro, Kentucky in 1936, 20,000 people gathered in the morning sun to watch Rainy Bethia hang, and the spectacle proved so grotesque, so undeniably carnival-like, that America quietly agreed to never do this in public again. Outside Wrigley Field in 1932, thousands packed the bleachers and spilled onto the surrounding streets, watching America's pastime unfold not from seats they owned, but from any patch of Chicago ground they could find. In an Oklahoma City workshop in 1917, two boys, one 14, one just 12, packed ice cream cones by the thousands while the boss justified their presence with a shrug and a single careless sentence. Posed beneath a crystal chandelier at Schönbrunn Palace in 1910, Emperor Franz Joseph I grips his mountain stick with the practiced ease of a man who has ruled an empire for decades and still finds comfort in simpler things. At Camp Kearney in San Diego in 1918, a soldier sits peeling onions with his gas mask firmly strapped on, finding in this absurd domestic chore a perfectly practical reason to wear the one thing designed to save his life. On the 22nd of October in 1895, a Paris train arrived at Montparnasse, running several minutes behind schedule, and the driver's desperate attempt to recover those lost minutes ended with the locomotive punching straight through the station wall. At Rancho del Cielo in 1992, two men who had held the fate of nations in their hands posed together in cowboy hats, the Cold War behind them, the weight of history somehow lighter in the California ranch air. In a sun-baked Arizona landscape in 1984, George Lucas stood surrounded by handcrafted models in the ILM warehouse, quietly building entire galaxies from foam, wire, and paint, long before computers would take that work away. At a White House gala in 1986, John Travolta extended his hand to Princess Diana, and what followed on that dance floor became, by his own account, the single brightest memory he carried out of an entire decade. In 1936, after just 326 days on the throne, King Edward V surrendered the British crown for love, choosing an American woman twice divorced over an empire that would not bend to accommodate her. Along the Berlin Wall in 1961, West Berlin parents pressed their children against the barrier and lifted them high so grandparents on the eastern side could see the small faces that a divided city was already beginning to erase. Somewhere in the 1910s, a baby teetered upright inside a wicker walking frame while a mother bent over the laundry nearby, both of them busy learning something new, each entirely unaware they were being watched by history. At Cape Canaveral on November 16, 1963, President Kennedy stood beside Wernher von Braun and looked toward the sky with the focused ambition of a man who had 6 days left to live and still believed in the future. In a small rehearsal space around 1983, 4 young men with long hair and second-hand gear stared into a camera with the raw, unpolished hunger of a band that had not yet broken the world but fully intended to. On the set of The Godfather in 1972, Diane Keaton and Al Pacino stood between takes, 2 young actors caught mid-conversation, neither of them yet understanding the scale of what they were helping to build. On the Alaskan tundra in 1915, an Inuit family gathered outside their summer dwelling, standing together with the quiet dignity of people whose civilization had survived centuries of ice, wind, and everything the world had thrown at them. Somewhere in Hamburg, Police Sergeant Ernst Muller cruised the city streets in his sidecar with his Alsatian, Aster, riding beside him, a dog he trusted so completely he called him the eyes in the back of his head. Over a British airfield in 1942, the Battle of Britain raged on, but between sorties a Royal Air Force pilot sat calmly in a folding chair and got a haircut, finding 15 minutes of ordinary life inside an extraordinary war. In Oklahoma in 1906, a cowboy shook out his lasso with loose-wristed ease while his companions watched from the shade of their covered wagon, the open land stretching endlessly behind them, still young enough to be called the West. In Cimarron County in April of 1936, a farmer and his two sons leaned into the darkness of a rolling dust storm, their figures almost swallowed by the sky, walking forward because stopping was not something that family knew how to do. In 1945, two scientists posed with the plutonium core of the Fat Man bomb, a sphere small enough to cradle in both hands and ordinary enough in appearance to make it almost impossible to understand what it was about to do. In 1897, Alfred Stieglitz turned his camera toward a Venice canal and captured something the postcards always missed: the stillness between gondolas, the weight of the water, the way a city can hold its breath for a photographer. In 1864, a delegation of Japanese samurai in full traditional dress stood before the Sphinx in Egypt, their presence alone collapsing centuries and continents into a single frame that history still struggles to fully explain. Inside a Tampa cigar factory in the early 1900s, a lector's steady voice rolled out over row after row of workers, reading them the morning news as their hands moved through the tobacco leaves without ever slowing down. From a hilltop overlooking Atlanta in 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman surveyed a city on the edge of fire, a man already thinking not in battles but in campaigns, and in campaigns not in days but in the shape of whole wars. Inside the New York Times composing room in 1942, typesetters laid out that evening's sports page by hand, letter by letter, while somewhere above them editors rewrote the headlines on a war that was changing faster than the presses could keep up. On a city street in the 1920s, a lone rider balanced atop a single-wheeled machine with the focused nonchalance of someone who had decided the bicycle had too many wheels and the future deserved something far more difficult. Inside a Victorian portrait studio in the 1890s, a couple fought back laughter while a photographer demanded stillness, their trembling shoulders betraying everything their locked jaws were trying to hide, turning a formal portrait into something genuinely alive. Stonehenge stood on Salisbury Plain in 1867 exactly as it had stood for 4,000 years, except now a man with a large black camera had set up his tripod in the grass and asked it politely to stay still. In her Paris laboratory in 1905, Marie Curie bent over her work with the same focused calm that had already won her one Nobel Prize and would soon win her another, unaware that the research itself was quietly killing her. In 1950, a French man raised a bottle of Coca-Cola to his lips for what a photographer from Life magazine captured as the moment America's sweetest export arrived on European soil and asked the continent if it was thirsty. Outside a St. Louis garage around 1906, a Firestone repair truck sat gleaming and ready, a rolling advertisement for the new religion of the automobile, in a decade when the road ahead still felt like it had no end. In 1929, somewhere in America, workers built a tower out of seized alcohol barrels, stacking the contraband toward the sky before destroying it all, turning prohibition into theater and making the waste look almost festive from a distance. Through a 20-foot cedar stump in Washington's state in 1920, the Pacific Highway ran straight and narrow, a road that had been built directly through an ancient tree because the tree was there first and the road did not care. On the set of Conan the Destroyer in 1983, Arnold Schwarzenegger stood between Wilt Chamberlain and Andre the Giant, three men whose combined physical presence was enough to make everyone else on that set quietly reconsider their own dimensions. 200 feet above New York City in 1926, painters balanced on narrow scaffolding along the Woolworth Building's upper facade, touching up the stone with steady hands, while the streets below moved like a river they could no longer hear. Somewhere in the North Atlantic chaos of 1912, a Titanic survivor paused to sign an autograph, their hands still steady, their name suddenly carrying the weight of a disaster that the whole world was still trying to understand. In the trenches of the First World War, Australian soldiers fitted rifles with water-filled tins that slowly pulled the triggers, building a ghost army of sound and shadow that let real men slip away silently into the dark. Along a country road in the Pays de Bouc in 20th century France, a mailman made his rounds on foot or horseback through scattered villages, carrying letters that were sometimes the only connection between people and the wider world beyond their fields. In the forests of Värmland, Sweden, in 1916, Marit Olsdotter, born 1857, stood before her home with the unhurried composure of a woman who lived her entire life in that landscape and saw no reason to perform for a camera. In the summer of 1974, the Grateful Dead assembled a wall of sound 3 stories high and 100 feet wide, a monument to pure audio ambition that weighed 75 tons and filled every corner of the open air with something close to perfect clarity. In Tokyo in 1959, a young man knelt carefully to help his date lace up her ice skates, a moment of quiet consideration caught by John Dominus that said more about a changing Japan than any headline from that year could manage. On the New York City subway in 1963, commuters sat shoulder to shoulder behind open newspapers, each one sealed inside their own story, the train carrying them all forward through the dark while the city above them ran its usual noise. In a Paris cafe in June of 1934, Salvador Dali and Man Ray sat for Carl Van Vechten's camera, 2 men who had devoted their lives to dismantling reality, looking for just this one photograph, almost entirely like ordinary people. On the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu set pen to paper while a watching world held its breath, and in the few seconds it took to sign, the Second World War was over. Across the dusty farms of Oklahoma in the 1890s, a traveling salesman drove his wagon from homestead to homestead, selling bottled cures with confident promises and small print that nobody read in a country still young enough to believe in miracles. Inside the Coventry Ordnance Works during the First World War, a woman was lowered into the barrel of a 15-inch naval gun to clean the rifling by hand, her small figure disappearing into a weapon built to reshape the world by force. In a Finnish clearing in 1954, a family of 4 sat swinging together on a homemade contraption of their own design, the simple pleasure of it unfolding against the birch trees with the easy warmth of people who had built everything they needed. drawn on paper in 1920 with the clean optimism of the post-war era, a proposed map divided Europe into 24 neat slices, each one a new nation, a new identity, a new peace, offered as a solution and ignored as a fantasy. At Shornamed Fort in Kent in 1940, British soldiers in full drag, interrupted mid-rehearsal by an air raid, manned the anti-aircraft guns still, wearing their costumes, performing their duty with absolute seriousness and absolutely extraordinary clothing. In the back lanes of early 20th century Europe, rat catchers moved through cities most people preferred not to think about, running the highest risks so that the people above them, in every sense of the word, could live a little more safely. Outside a Firestone tire shop in St. Louis around 1906, a service truck sat loaded and ready on a street, still figuring out what automobiles meant, the rubber and steel industry already understanding that wherever cars went, flat tires would follow. On a busy street in the 1920s, two women strolled together in matching confidence and bold fashion, parading through the decade with the particular energy of people who knew exactly how good they looked and wanted everyone to notice. On a London street corner in 1910, a woman stood behind her cart of fresh fish and called out to the passing crowd, holding her place in a city that moved fast and loud, exactly as her mother had held it before her. On their wedding day in Germany in 1901, a young couple stood stiffly before the camera in their finest clothes, two people at the very beginning of a century that would ask more of them than either of them could possibly imagine. Inside an IBM laboratory in 1958, an engineer bent over a sprawling tangle of wires and components, threading the nervous system of a machine that filled an entire room and could do a fraction of what now fits inside a pocket. On a road outside Saigon on June 19, 1972, a South Vietnamese family ran together through the smoke and heat of an airstrike, Nick Utt's camera catching the precise moment when the full cost of that war became impossible to look away from. Inside a Stockholm gymnasium in the 1890s, a gentleman submitted himself to one of Dr. Zander's elaborate mechanical contraptions, his expression caught somewhere between determination and deep regret, sacrificing every comfort in pursuit of a stronger and longer life. In Japan in 1866, a mother held her child for the camera with the measured stillness that early photography demanded. The love between them caught not in motion, but in the quiet weight of two people pressed close together in the frame. In Egypt in the late 1800s, a group of laborers stood beside a toppled statue of Ramses II, the fallen colossus dwarfing the men who were trying to move it, a king still commanding the landscape 3,000 years after his death. In New York's Central Park in 1904, children climbed into goat-drawn carriages for a penny a ride, their laughter rising over the sound of small hooves on gravel, the city briefly soft and slow around them on a Sunday afternoon. In a company house in Scotts Run, West Virginia, in September of 1938, a coal miner's wife sat with 3 of her children in a home that belonged to the mine and held them all with the particular dignity of people who owned very little and let go of nothing. In a Washington laboratory in 1962, scientists gathered around scale models of the moon's surface, mapping light and shadow with careful hands, practicing for a journey that no human being had made yet and that only the most extraordinary ambition could make real. Rising from the streets of Constantinople in 1890, the column of Constantine and the Ghazi Atik Ali Pasha Mosque shared the same sky as they had for centuries, 2 monuments from 2 empires standing in quiet proximity in a city too layered to fully belong to either. In the portrait studios of the 1800s, mothers pressed themselves behind fabric and furniture to hide from the long exposure times, becoming ghosts in their own children's photographs, present in every sense except the one the camera could record. Along the assembly line in Stuttgart in the 1970s, Porsche 911s moved through the factory in careful stages, each one taking shape with the methodical precision of a car brand that understood that speed, when properly built, does not need to be hurried. In a cramped Los Angeles writer's room in 1992, the team behind The Simpsons gathered around a table covered in scripts and coffee cups, working on a show that most of television had already underestimated and America was about to make immortal. At Princeton in 1944, Albert Einstein sat fit for Lucien Agner's camera with the unhurried presence of a man who had already rearranged the laws of physics and now spent his afternoons sailing, playing violin, and politely refusing to wear socks. Somewhere in a Radio Shack catalog from the late 1980s, a full page of computers, printers, and modems was priced high enough to buy a car, a quiet monument to the era just before technology decided to become affordable for everyone. On a Barcelona hillside in 1905, the unfinished towers of La Sagrada Familia rose against the sky like something half-remembered from a dream, and Tony Gaudí, already deep into a project he knew would outlast him by more than a century. In the vaults of the Krakow Royal Armories, a suit of 16th-century Polish armor assembled from over 1,000 steel plates and rings stands as a proof that someone once spent an extraordinary amount of time making sure that not 1 inch of a man could be reached. In Maidenhead in 1900, a group of ironmongers stepped out of the shop and lined up for a photograph during their break, straightening their aprons and their spines with equal care, proud of their trade and not remotely embarrassed to show it. At their Texas ranch in 1963, Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird sat together on a fence in the late afternoon light, 2 people still months away from the moment that would make one of them the most powerful figure in the world. In Beverly Hills in October of 1969, 17-year-old Rosemary Shung stood for Life magazine in a fringed dress she had memorized from a store window, reconstructed entirely from memory, completed in under 24 hours, and delivered for a fraction of the retail price. At the Festival of Britain in 1946, designer Benjamin Bowden unveiled his Spacelander bicycle, all curves and chrome and aerodynamic ambition, a vehicle that looked like it had arrived from a decade that had not quite happened yet and might never come. On a film set in 1977, the cast of Star Wars gathered without their costumes and suddenly became what they always were, a handful of young actors, a man in a suit and a small person in a tin shell, holding together a universe nobody had believed in yet. In the desert in 1898, an American photographer framed a Bedouin couple against the open horizon, their stillness and composure filling the frame with a dignity that needed no caption, no context, and no explanation from the man behind the lens. In Rwanda in the 1920s, men shaped their hair into the sculpted, swept forms of the Amasunzu style, a practice centuries older than the photograph, each shape carrying meaning that the camera could record but not fully translate. On the ash-covered streets of Chicago in 1871, horse-drawn streetcars rolled through the smoldering ruins of the Great Fire while the city was still too hot to properly grieve, moving through destruction with the mechanical persistence of a place that had already decided to rebuild. In Spencer, Iowa, in 1936, a woman swept the front steps of her Depression-era shack with the same careful attention she would have brought to a far better home because the dignity of the work, she understood, had nothing to do with what the work was. Mounted on a wall at the U.S. Navy Museum, a 26-inch plate of armor from a Japanese Yamato-class battleship bears a clean hole punched straight through by a 16-inch shell, the two objects standing together as a permanent argument about the limits of protection.